MOS Alvin Tan.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, sir, I thank the members Mr. Don Wee, Mr. Saktiandi Supat, and Associate Professor James Lim, who have spoken in support of the bill. I will first address Mr. Don Wee's questions relating to the IMF's role in dealing with climate change. Now, in line with the IMF's mandate to promote global macroeconomic and financial stability, and recognizing that climate change can pose a significant risk to members' economic well-being, the IMF has indeed stepped up efforts to incorporate climate considerations and goals across its surveillance, lending, and capacity development activities. On surveillance, the IMF provides guidance to members on appropriate macroeconomic and fiscal policies that facilitate climate mitigation, adaptation, and the transition to a low-carbon economy. The IMF incorporates climate risks analysis into its financial sector assessment programs, or FSAP, to assess the impact of climate change on the stability of members' financial sectors. The IMF has also developed tools to help governments identify and select good quality public investment projects for building low-carbon and climate-resilient infrastructure that can attract climate investments. On lending, the IMF created a new lending facility, the Resilience and Sustainability Trust, RST, which the Associate Member Professor Lim talked about. It did so in April 2022 to provide affordable long-term financing to low-income and vulnerable middle-income member countries in support of macroeconomic policy reforms related to structural challenges, including climate change. On the RST, IMF has indeed requested for our contributions, and MAS is assessing the request. Now, the RST also aims to catalyze financing from other stakeholders for climate-related projects. So I agree with Mr. James Lim on the need for Singapore to play our role, including in initiatives like the RST. Here also, the multilateral development banks, or MDBs, such as the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank, have crucial roles to play, as these institutions seek to crowd in private capital to close climate financing gaps, including by scaling the use of blended finance. And MAS will continue to work closely with the IMF and the MDBs on climate financing initiatives in the region. Now, on capacity building, the IMF and its training institutes, including the IMF Singapore Regional Training Institute, or STI, conduct training courses centered on the macroeconomic implications of climate change. Now, these courses are targeted at policymakers from the region, including Singapore and our neighbours. And as I mentioned earlier, MAS has been providing funding support and guidance for the STI on programs that best meets members' capacity needs, including on the climate front. Mr. Don Wee, Mr. Saktiandi Supat, and Associate Professor James Lim raised several questions on the different forms of financial support Singapore has provided to the IMF. I'd like to thank all members for the support of Singapore's continuing contributions to IMF's programs and arrangements. Singapore will indeed continue to contribute to global efforts to bolster the IMF's resources, and we will carefully assess the merits of future requests, and parliamentary approval will be sought. But let me go into the different forms of financial support, even as we stand ready to assess each and every potential request. First, on quotas. Singapore's quota subscription of special drawing rights 3.9 billion in the IMF is a funded contribution. It is part of Singapore's OFR, of official foreign reserves, and earns interest based on the SDR's interest rate. Now, a quarter of the members' quota subscription is usually paid in SDRs or foreign currencies acceptable to the IMF, with the remainder paid in the members' own currency. Now, the portion of Singapore's quota subscription that is paid in SDRs or foreign currency can be repaid to Singapore on demand to obtain reserve asset to meet our balance of payment needs, balance of payment financing needs, as and when that need arises. Next, the IMF also relies on borrowed resources to support its lending activity. These currently arise, as I mentioned earlier, through the new arrangements to borrow, or NAB, and the bilateral borrowing arrangements, BBAs. Since the BWAA was amended in 2016, Singapore has made loan commitments of $1.9 billion to the IMF under the new arrangements to borrow for 2021 to 2025, and $1.7 billion under a bilateral borrowing arrangement for 2021 to 2024. Only members with strong external positions such as Germany, Japan, Switzerland, the United States, and Singapore are requested by the IMF to contribute to the NAB and the BBAs. The full list of contributors to both the NABs and the BBAs, respectively, are available on the IMF's website. Now, for these loan arrangements, the IMF uses standard form agreements signed across all the contributors so that the same terms apply across all contributors, and there's also parity of treatment. Third, Singapore has also contributed grants as part of the IMF's multilateral initiatives. In November 2016, Singapore contributed $20 million grant to the Poverty Reduction and Growth Trust, the PRGT, and $0.3 million grant to the Catastrophe Containment and Relief Trust, the CCRT. Now, the CCRT provides debt release for the IMF's poorest and most vulnerable members in the event of a global health pandemic or natural catastrophe. More recently, to enhance the capacity of the IMF to assist vulnerable low-income member countries to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic, the MAS provided 3 grants. First, an additional grant of $17.6 million to the IMF's CCRT. Second, a grant of $2 million to the IMF's COVID-19 Crisis Capacity Development Initiative, which seeks to meet the urgent capacity development needs of countries affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. And 3, a grant of $0.97 million to the IMF's Trust for Special Poverty Reduction and Growth Operations for heavily indebted poor countries. Now, to ensure transparency and accountability, the MAS has issued media releases for each of these contributions on its website, in addition to publishing the information on the Government Gazette. As Associate Professor James Lim mentioned, and also both members Saktiandi Supat and Don Wee, it is indeed in Singapore's interest to contribute grants to support the IMF's initiatives, such as the PRGT to assist vulnerable low-income countries, but also provided that the BWAA safeguards are complied with. This was explained to the House in 2016 when the BWAA was last amended to empower MAS to contribute grants to the IMF. By contributing to such initiatives, Singapore joins other members of the global community in supporting the IMF's role to safeguard global monetary and financial stability and foster sustainable growth and prosperity for its members, and also to generate the goodwill that members had mentioned. This will in turn not just generate goodwills, but also benefit Singapore's economy and financial stability. I will now turn to members' questions on the specific amendments proposed. First, let me cover questions relating to the amendment to exclude MAS's financing of IMF's operations in Singapore from the application of Section 6A2 and 6A3. Now, the policy intent has always been and continues to be to apply the safeguards specific to both these sections only to grants provided to IMF to assist member countries under IMF arrangements or programs. These grants are different from MAS's financing of the IMF offices in Singapore. As I mentioned in my earlier second reading speech, when Singapore contributes grants to support international efforts, including IMF arrangements or programs to assist member countries in need, we do so alongside other country contributors. So MAS cannot dictate the terms because there are many other contributors to such arrangements or programs. We thus have to rely on the IMF to ensure there's proper governance in administration of the grants. Therefore, it would be prudent to subject such grants to additional domestic safeguards in Section 6A2 and Section 6A3 of the BWAA, including parliamentary oversight, which the member had mentioned earlier. In contrast, the scope of MAS's financing for the IMF's offices and how it can be used are clearly stated in the respective Memoranda of Understanding, MOUs, between the IMF and Singapore. IMF exercises direct oversight on the use of the funds, and the IMF must meet MAS's reporting requirements. Now, instead of parliamentary oversight, MAS's funding of the IMF's operations in Singapore is subject to the approval of the President. MAS's funding of the IMF offices in Singapore is drawn from MAS's overall budget, which requires the President's approval pursuant to Article 22B of the Constitution, read with Section 166 of the MAS Act. Presidential approval is required in every financial year, even if past reserves are not used. Now, proposed amendment then clarifies the distinction between such funding support for IMF offices in Singapore and grants support to international efforts. It is also in line with the current practice for other international organizations that establish offices in Singapore. The current practice, however, does not explicitly require Parliament to try to fix by a resolution the maximum amount of grants to be given under a specific grant agreement by agencies to support the operations of Singapore-based offices of other international organizations. So under the IDA question, which the member mentioned, James Lim, earlier, under the International Development Association Act, or IDA Act, there is no requirement, therefore, for Parliament to approve grants made by MOF to relevant international organizations' offices. And the issue is covered in the present amendments. The issue covered in the present amendment here, therefore, does not arise in the case of the IDA Act. Now, in terms of the quantum of financing that has been provided to the IMF offices in Singapore, between financial year 2019 and financial year 2020, MAS provided an average of about $2.3 million to the SDI annually and about $390,000 to the RRO annually. Through their regional surveillance and capacity development activities, the IMF Singapore offices strengthened Singapore's status as a regional financial hub. Let me now turn to the amendment to waive the early repayment requirement in certain circumstances. And specific to answer Mr. Saktiandi Supat's question, the NAB as well as BBAs are examples of IMF's multilateral loan arrangements, which involve the use of standard form agreements. For the MAB, the IMF confirmed that an arrangement can be made to facilitate repayment of a member's NAB contribution should the need arise. But in the case of the BBA, the IMF confirmed that the BBA cannot be suspended or prematurely terminated. Thus, the issue of early repayment did not arise. Now, the proposed amendment therefore provides clarity on the statutory requirements applicable to similar agreements for loans or financial assistance based on our engagement with the IMF on both the NAB as well as the BBA. Regardless, any such loans or financial assistance that is granted to the IMF under the BWAA will continue to be subject to strong safeguards, and the risks to Singapore's official foreign reserves from the absence of this early repayment option is very low. Why? Well, first, when Singapore provides a loan in support of IMF arrangements or programs, Singapore, as I mentioned earlier, lends to the IMF, not directly to member countries in need. Therefore, Singapore's loan exposure is to the IMF and not to the borrowing countries. Second, as the IMF enjoys preferred creditor status, loans granted by the IMF must be repaid ahead of all other creditors. Third, should Singapore have a balance of payment need, the IMF is obliged under our loan agreements to repay the loan to Singapore immediately. And finally, the IMF has an excellent repayment history and has never defaulted on repayments to its creditors. I emphasize that where the IMF arrangement or program can be prematurely terminated or suspended, and where the terms of any agreements for loans or financial assistance can be unilaterally amended, MAS will require the IMF to include an early repayment provision in accordance to the BWAA. Finally, Mr. Saktiandi Supat spoke of the need to be prudent in public spending. And I want to assure him and emphasize that the MAS will continue to exercise a high degree of prudence when considering each IMF request for financial assistance. So I believe I've addressed the members' queries, and I thank members once again for their interest in and support of the bill. So I beg to move.
The question is that the bill be now read a second time. As many as are of the opinion say aye. Aye. To the contrary say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it.
Bretton Woods Agreement Amendment Bill.
Committee stage what day?
Now, sir, I beg to move that Parliament will immediately resolve itself into a committee on the bill.
The question is that Parliament will immediately resolve itself into a committee on the bill. As many as are of the opinion say aye. Aye. To the contrary say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The question is that clauses 1 to 3 stand part of the bill. As many as are of the opinion say aye. To the contrary say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Bill to be reported. MOS Alvin Tan.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, I beg to report that the bill has been considered in committee and agreed to without amendments.
Third reading what day?
Now, sir, I beg to move that the bill be now read a third time.
The question is that the bill be now read a third time. As many as are of the opinion say aye. To the contrary say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it.
Bretton Woods Agreements Amendment Bill. Item 2, Building and Related Works Miscellaneous Amendments Bill.
Leader.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, I beg to move that Parliament do now adjourn.
The question is that Parliament do now adjourn. As many as are of the opinion say aye. Aye. To the contrary say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order, order.